Director of the Alaska Division of Agriculture, and I'm actually down over at DEC at the lab, and Dr. Robert Gerlach, we call him Dr. Bob. We have been being asked a lot of questions about the avian flu, and that is a state vet issue, and so Dr. Bob graciously agreed to have a chat today and kind of tell us what's going on, and then we'll hopefully have some questions and answers. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll see if we have time to get through a few of them. So usually this takes about a half hour. We try to keep it within that because I know you're real busy. So Bob, thank you so much for giving us the time. I know you're really busy. So
no, it's great to be here, and you know, we're trying to put out some outreach material on our webpage, and then just yesterday I had a meeting with the Migratory Bird Co-Management Council discussing the same thing, because it is a concern, and it's something that over the last couple of years we've been seeing a larger and larger number of avian influenza outbreaks. It used to be very sporadic and rare, and now we're seeing them on a regular basis, and we're seeing them more diverse and spread than had been. And it generally associates around this virus is very easy to be spread among birds, and generally it's the wild waterfowl that are the ones that are generally the ones that are the reservoir in the wildlife for it. Okay. And then they spread it. So as we see intensification of agriculture occur in Asia, we have a large population of people, large population of poultry. You'll see an intermixing with wildlife there, and then a spread. And I think the outbreak that we're seeing now, the USDA was very concerned about it in 2019 and 20, right. Because we could start to see the outbreak occur in Asia and spread. Okay. And as soon as it started to spread in these other areas like northern Russia, that's when the lights went off. It's like, this is not behaving like the typical Asia influenza virus that stays locally. This one had been spreading pretty rapidly. And the last time it spread up into northern part of Russia like that was in 2014 and 15, when we had our last outbreak in the Pacific Northwest and in through the Midwest with, I think it was 50 million birds that were affected and died as a result. And so there's been a lot of preparation for this and watching, and this particular virus is very unusual in the fact that most of the time wild birds don't seem to be affected by it. But in this case, this virus has been very virulent. It's been there have been large mortality events in Europe. So there was, I think there was 16,000 birds, geese that died in United Kingdom, and I think they had 8 or 10,000 reported anyway in Israel. And so that this was definitely unusual. And so when we saw it come across, and it was in December of 2021, and when it hit Nova Scotia, and then after that it has been rapidly spreading across the United States.
I know a number of states came out just a few weeks ago, and they were trying to keep it quarantined and set up the areas. And it doesn't seem like I mean, it's been successful to a degree. So kind of tell the process. How do they do that, and how do we do it here? Because I mean, it's obviously something that you're very concerned about, and what are we going to do? So
yeah, it is, and this, like I say, this virus is different. In 2014 and 15, we saw a lot of lateral spread of that virus from one commercial operation to another because of poor biosecurity and the fact that we didn't understand the virulence of that strain. This is totally different now. We're seeing outbreaks across the United States, and I think there's 25 states that have commercial outbreaks.
Right.
There's 35 states that have detected it in wild birds, and generally we detect it in wild birds first, and then all of a sudden we see these outbreaks in commercial operations. But what's unusual is that the commercial operations are independently being affected by wild birds, and there's not lateral spread, not as great as there had been in the past. And so, the focus has been trying to make sure that you have containment and biosecurity on your farm.
Right.
And there's been a lot of, not just commercial operations, but there's probably just as many backyard affected flocks as well.
Right.
And that's a big concern. I mean, today, Montana just announced that they had 2 backyard flocks break with avian influenza. And just like some other states, as soon as that happened, they went ahead and started the quarantine and started to go ahead and try to clear up those infections. And the first thing they did was to stop poultry exhibitions, poultry shows, and fairs.
Right.
And so I think it's going to be really important for us as we look at it. I mean, we're a little bit different because our population is more widespread, but we do have a lot of people that have backyard flocks that are outside. And
Absolutely.
And if they're by a waterway where there's waterfowl, then I mean there's a higher probability and a higher risk for transfer of those diseases to the domestic birds. And what we want to do is try to go ahead and keep this as contained as possible, so we don't have to go through those canceling of avian shows. I mean, that's really important for the state and 4-H kids with respect to getting their birds out and going to the state fairs. So.
Right. So one of the questions that I had was, this is when we import a lot of chicks this time of the year. So do you have any advice on that, or what are your thoughts? Because every spring there's a lot of young fowls, mailed, shipped. What do you think is going to happen in that realm?
Yeah, and that's a good point, because we're seeing in probably the last 10 years a dramatic increase in the number of chicks that are imported. I mean, we used to have probably on average around maybe around 50,000. We're up last year over 120,000 birds that have been imported into the state. And unfortunately, some of those hatcheries that we're importing from are in some control zones, and that's been a great concern. We've done really pretty good outreach, talking with people importing them and the feed stores that import them and sell them, to go ahead and be aware, so that our best management for this is early detection and reporting. So if people have a backyard flock and they have birds that are sick or dying, then you really need to go ahead and go through the reporting process, either your local veterinarian, cooperative extension, even if you're in a remote area like we had in one of the remote communities, because these birds are being imported. It used to be mostly in the populated areas in Anchorage and Delta, Fairbanks, and the Kenai, and some in Juneau. I mean, now we have them all throughout, from Port Alexander to Sitka, all the way up to McGrath and some other pretty remote areas. And if you're in a remote area and there's no local veterinarian, obviously, there may not even be a DEC office, then contact Fish and Game. Or you can contact even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and USGS offices, because they may not be able to respond, but they're able to go ahead and help connect us with that to go ahead and get samples.
Idea.
And we've been getting our test kits out so that we have we have some out to the raptor rehabilitation centers, to the zoos, the exhibitions, up to the university, and even to our colleagues in Department of Interior, so that they have kits if we need to respond to something.
Okay. So is there anything that I've missed that you said you're working on the outreach? This is, for the farming community, is there anything that they should be watching, anywhere they should be going? You're going to put some stuff on your website, I assume, so.
Yep, we've got put stuff on our website and links to both the USDA sites for Defend the Flock, as well as their reporting of both the wild bird and domestic outbreaks. And the basic thing is to go ahead and look at your flock. If you've got a backyard flock, or if you've got even a larger, some of these larger operations have several hundred to 1,000 birds there, you need to look at that as your investment. Right. And you wouldn't leave all your money in your bank account just sitting on the kitchen table. You'd want to go ahead and protect that. So your protection is going to be having some biosecurity there. Prevent people from coming in before cleaning up. Try to keep your blockage away from wild birds. If you had bird feeders in your backyard, I'd remove them so that you're not attracting wild birds. And if you're feeding your birds, try to feed them inside and not outside, so you're attracting wild birds. So what you can do is the best you can for that. For some of the zoos and some of these other areas that have pretty valuable animals there, they're actually taking them inside, they're not letting them out. Right. And you've got to go through that level of protection. And you've got to be comfortable with it, so not everybody has to go into really severe, shutdown. You can go ahead and say, well, I think I can go ahead and give my feeling of protection for my flock doing this. And if you have questions, that's one thing that we do in our office, is that we have just two veterinarians here. So what we do is collaborate with Fish and Game, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the USGS, Cooperative Extension, and the 4-H folks to go ahead, and if they have questions, producers can go in, or poultry owners can go in and ask them questions, and we can try to get them answers. And the best is to learn as much as you can, and then ask questions, and we can try to help you as best we can that way.
So what are some of the early signs? Because we have a lot of new people from the last couple of years that got into flocks, and they asked, we get some phone calls ourselves at the division, and it's like basic questions about, well, does this sound like a sick chicken? And I'm like, well, that's not us to answer, but so if there's anything in this realm, what are you looking for?
Yeah, and it was good because we just talked with John yesterday or the day before about how to take care of livestock, and the best thing is that you need to be observant of them and know what normal behavior is. And so if you get a group of young chicks in, you watch, you feed them, and you give them the right food, and then if you see any change in behavior, and it can be with this avian influenza, unfortunately with domestic poultry, it's generally mortality you see. Oh. But before that, you may just see, if you're watching them close, you may just see them maybe not running up to the feeder or not reacting to you when you come into the coop, that they're having just a little bit of an abnormal behavior, not acting like they normally were. And that's generally your first sign to really be watching and observing them closely. And if you have any concerns, then we just had a call, had somebody come in yesterday. It was somebody here in Anchorage. They said, one of my chickens isn't doing well. So he brought the chicken in, and because he didn't have a veterinarian he could get to at the time period, so we went ahead, examined the bird here, took some samples as part of our avian influenza surveillance, and we're going to go ahead and follow up on that. But a lot of the local veterinarians have great resources, and I would always check locally before you go ahead and necessarily reach out to a far distant resource that way.
Right. Well, that's good. John, do we have any questions? So it sounds like we're doing pretty good. So is there any concern with COVID and that we've had transmission between the animal and human and that. So is there, I just trying to clear up any things that you've heard or those kind of questions. Is there any concerns that way? Or?
Yeah, there was a big concern when we were talking to the Migratory Bird Council, because a lot of subsistence hunters are going to harvest, the spring migration as they come back up. And at this point, we don't see, and U.S. or CDC has not shown this particular strain of virus as being very risky for people.
Okay.
And I think out of the time that it spread from a year ago till now, I think only one person has had some illness, respiratory illness from it. And so you think that's almost insignificant.
Right.
And so the thing is if you're hunting and out hunting ducks, then you go ahead and follow the standard procedures. You don't harvest an animal that's acting abnormal. If you find something, you shoot some ducks and you're going to go ahead and clean them, you want to go ahead and use standard sanitation, wear gloves, and then make sure you cook that meat properly. With your chickens, you would be doing the same thing.
Right.
In most cases, like I said, the chickens and turkeys and game birds like pheasants or quail are, especially pheasants and quail, seem to be highly susceptible to this virus and show unfortunately the worst consequences of high mortality rates. But your idea is that if you detect something that's abnormal in your flock, the earlier we can report it, the earlier we can go ahead and get a diagnosis on this, then the better you can feel, because there's other pathogens out there that can cause these same symptoms, and we want to make sure that if we do find something, we can go ahead and contain it and prevent it from spreading other places.
Right. So is there anything if they suspect their flock and they do have it, is what is going to be the next steps that the local vet and them are going to work to do that containment? And
yeah, generally the thing is there'll be an examination of the birds and then collection of samples, and then we can go ahead and we'll send those out to an outside lab to go ahead and get them tested. We used to have the capability here at this lab to go ahead and do the testing, but there's a cost and expense to that, and so we found it more efficient to go ahead and be able to send those samples out to the NOM lab down in Washington. And generally, if we have a high suspicion of a case, we'll take duplicate samples, send some to Washington State and some directly to USDA. So if there is any possible, what they call a non-negative, we can go ahead and get it confirmed to a positive as fast as possible. And generally, just unfortunately, when this is a reportable disease, so if it gets into a flock, the birds are going to be quarantined, and then they're going to be euthanized to go ahead and prevent the spread, because this can be a problem. Just like with any of the other viruses, like COVID, the more it can go ahead and interact, it can go ahead and increase its virulence or increase its pathogenicity and cause more death in birds, or it may be like some strains of COVID where it seems to be less of a problem, and we don't know what that's going to happen, how that's going to happen, so we want to go ahead and try to prevent any type of widespread problem, because we don't want to have to go ahead and shut down our shows and our state fairs for this.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I ask about the euthanization is I want people to know this is really important to do the prevention, right?
That's
so
right.
It's like, oh, this is not kind of a minor deal. No, this is a major deal. You do not want to get this in your flock, and unfortunately, if you do get it in your flock, there are rules and regulations and requirements that you have. This is what we want to do. This is what we must do. And I sometimes like to let people know is like, look, our hands are tied with how we handle these outbreaks. You have your requirements, and I'm assuming that you work with the USDA and do that. So
yeah, this is a reportable disease, so we work with USDA. But the point is that what you want to do is, if you have a problem, is identify it early, and then. Because say if you think, oh, my birds died, but I only had 5 and I'm not going to worry about it. Well, that virus can spend a long time in the environment and be viable, especially if it's a wet or moist environment. And so we want to be able to go in, and if there's a problem, identify it, and then help make sure we can go through good cleanup and disinfection. And so before you go ahead and get new birds, or move or share equipment with somebody else, to make sure that we can go ahead and we're not spreading that. Because what we don't want to do is have an outbreak in one area, but somebody comes in and before we know what's going on, have exposed other flocks, and that you can have injury or do harm to other people's birds that way.
That's a great point. Yeah. Disinfecting and doing that really needs to be done well if you do have the problem. So.
No, that's exactly it. And I think the point that we can do is knowing ahead of time, doing your biosecurity, so that if you're going to bring new birds into your flock, that maybe you want to go ahead and keep them isolated for about 2 weeks before you go bring them in, and know where you're getting them, so that you know the background and the health of the flock you're getting them from. And we don't want to go ahead and prevent people from increasing their flocks or enjoying their birds. We just want to make sure that we can provide them with the best knowledge they can protect that investment. Because when you go ahead and it's oftentimes one of the best things you can do with having your birds is to go ahead and start to just keep records of how many birds you have, how much feed you're spending or you're buying to feed them, and what your equipment costs, so that all that adds up, and you start to realize that maybe those 10 chickens are worth more than you think they are. It's not just a couple dollars a piece that you spent on them. There's a big investment, and then there's an investment in your time that you want to make sure that we're not putting that at risk, and that's going to be our main objective, is to try to help people do the best they can to keep that investment safe.
That's great. So I really appreciate your time. I know you're real busy. I always give the guests the last word. So is there any final words or comments you have?
Yeah, I just think, just reiterating that we know this is a problem. We know it's going to go ahead and may occur on a regular basis. Unfortunately, this is a particularly severe, virulent form of the virus that's causing a lot of damage to both the wildlife as well as commercial populations. And so the best we can do is is understand what we can do at our homes to go ahead and keep our animals healthy. We want to try to prevent that livestock or that poultry and wildlife interaction because that decreases our risks. You want to go ahead and have a biosecurity and a herd health plan. So having a herd health plan means, contacting your veterinarian and talking to them about it, or look at the other resources, because it's not just your local veterinarian. You can go ahead and talk to Cooperative Extension about your poultry. You can talk to the University of Alaska Veterinary School. They've got a new Cooperative Extension veterinarian, Dr. McCrae, who's there. And the staff there is great to go ahead and give you some recommendations. And then there's a lot of online resources from the USDA and other states' cooperative extensions that have a lot of good information about biosecurity, about poultry diseases, about poultry management, that you can do the best you can to make sure that you're going to have a really healthy, successful flock and going to keep having those eggs produced, and if you have your broilers, that you're going to have that chicken in the pot for dinner. So that's we want to go ahead and try to do the best we can to help our producers do have the best production they can from their birds.
Absolutely, and as we all know, food security is a big issue right now, and we're trying to grow Alaskan agriculture, and these are the kind of things that we have to do smarter and wiser and make sure that we're protecting ourselves. And I know, I grew up in this state, and we didn't have the problems that we do now because we were pretty isolated. Well, we're not so isolated anymore. And then when you add in this worldwide movement of birds, I mean, I got thinking about it, and I was like, oh dear, and so I really appreciate your time to give us some of that expertise you have, and if there's ever anything that we can do at the division on our side to help get the word out, let us know. Yeah. So we'll post this. We'll make sure that we get them to the sites you have, and looks like we have a question. So go ahead, John.
Yeah, we've got a few coming in. The first one is, are there any areas that are more at risk due to wild bird migration patterns?
Generally, if your coop or your property is next to a wetland or a lake or a river, then you're going to have a higher probability that these migratory birds are going to be flying in. So that's one thing to do. And so if you have a free-range chickens, then maybe you want to go ahead and put a temporary fence so they don't go down to the pond or to go down to the lake and prevent that immediate contact. Because this virus can spend a long time and be viable in the wet aquatic environment. So, and we've seen USGS and U.S. Fish and Wildlife have done some incredible studies. That was back in before 2014 and 15, where they found that the infected virus in the fall, and they went back and checked the spring, and it was still there after the ice melts out. So it can stay a long time, and the best thing you can do is have that separation, keep that distance from those wild birds.
Have we had any cases here in Alaska, and if so, where?
No, I mean, that's one of the things that, we're expecting the migratory birds to be up here in about 2 to 3 weeks, and we're going to expect that we're going to probably find it when we do, not we, but our partners do the surveillance in wild birds. So we have got USDA Wildlife Services, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the USGS, and Fish and Game that are all doing surveillance. And but when you look at it, and that's one thing that I always try to keep things in perspective. Look at the United States, and then if you lay a silhouette of Alaska over, we're stretching from sea to shining sea. So we've got a lot of area to cover, and what's really important is our reporting from the producers, or from hunters, or from people that are out and just seeing sick or either wild birds or domestic birds that are sick or not doing well, to go ahead and report that so we can go ahead and get out and identify what the problem is and see. I mean, every year we have mortality events in wild birds, but it's very rare that it's influenza. This year, that's not the case. They're seeing quite a number of snow geese, Canadian geese, and some shorebird species, and even raptors, eagles, and hawks that are being affected and dying in the lower 48. I mean, it's been
wow.
Very unusual with respect to what normally would expect with an influenza. So this is a good question.
You answered this a little bit earlier, but to reiterate, is this a disease that we have seen in the past, or is this something new?
No, I mean, we see outbreaks of avian influenza, and the one thing, it's very similar to what we dealt with COVID. So initially there was COVID, and they called it the Wuhan strain, and then there was a new strain that came out. Then there was the Omega, then there was the Omicron strain, and all these different strains. And that's what happens. The avian influenza has two protein surface markers that we name them by, an H protein and an N protein. And so there's 9 different H proteins and there's 16 different N proteins. The things that we worry about with respect to high pathogen avian influenza is the H5 and H7s are the ones that are generally hot button issues. And this particular virus is H5N1. And so it, like I said, it's got some pretty hot genes there that are causing some increased morbidity and mortality, increased pathogenicity, and increased spread than we've seen before.
One person is also asking, she has plans to do meat chickens and is wondering how vulnerable they are, and also if having covered pens or pens that move and are covered are better than uncovered pens?
Oh, I think that's a great question, because covered pens are going to go ahead and provide you a lot better protection, because even if you could end up having birds flying over and defecating and soiling the area your birds are grazing or foraging on. And if you have an open pen, then obviously your birds might get nervous and fly out and then get exposed. So having them contained and covered is great. And if you have a pen that's covered, the other ideal thing is to have your feeders and waters in the center of that pen and not along the edges where it might attract wild birds for coming in.
Great. That's all I have.
Okay. Some great questions.
Well, really appreciate you taking the time, and we'll keep working on this communication. Anytime you have issues, we'll do this again. And we'll make sure that we get this posted. We'll put these answers up, and we'll make sure that all the agencies you've mentioned, we got the links out there so that people can get to this information. And if there's anything further that comes along on this, thank you so much for doing some of the work you've done earlier in the week on animal health and how to take care of animals. And that's one of those things that, we're trying to help educate and work together from our interagency perspective to make sure that our farmers and ranchers and everybody has the best possible outcome for what they're doing.
Yeah, no, that's important. And it's like, say, the one thing that we want to stress is that there's a collaborative effort. We got to work together to do this, and not just the federal and state agencies, but the producers and the public to help us identify areas of concern, because it's a big state and there's not a lot of people on every point of it. So relying on that communication, that reporting is really critical for us to do the best job we can. So thanks so much.
All right. Well, everybody, that's it for this week. Next week, I'll probably be talking to you from Juneau. So going to go down and sit in and work with everybody on the Mariculture Conference. A whole other thing that the Division of Ag's gotten more involved in the last couple of years. So take care. Bye all.